Good afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and today I'm going to be reviewing to you The Legend of Zelda: Four Swords Adventures for the GameCube. This game would have been so perfect if they made a follow-up on the Wii U, or at least made an HD port, because with all the Game Boy Advance connectivity, it just screams this is our early attempt at making the Wii U gamepad. I can't be the only one who made that connection, can I? So this is actually a follow-up to the Game Boy Advance game The Legend of Zelda: Four Swords, which was originally intended as a supplement to the Game Boy Advance port of A Link to the Past. However, that was more or less a mini game slash extra thing to, I guess, add more new content to the Game Boy Advance port. So that only had 4 levels. This one has 21, assuming I'm doing the math correctly. However, you'll be surprised to know that this actually wasn't designed with the GameCube controller itself as the primary controller on a GameCube game. Just to further add to ridiculousness, when you go into an indoor area, the game switches to much more primitive graphics and even says Game Boy Advance SP at the bottom. And so my best friend actually asked me when he was watching this, "Are you playing this on an actual Game Boy Advance?" I said, "No, silly, this is on the GameCube," and he was actually surprised. So technical marvel aside, this is actually one of the weaker 2D Zeldas, and I'm not generally a 2D Zelda fan, but this one just really grinded my gears. With the others, it was more or less just because I was bored and I thought they were too hard. Whereas this, it's not exactly the difficulty that turns me off, although that's definitely a contributing factor. It's more so of just, this feels more like a tech demo slash experiment rather than a full-fledged game. So the main premise is that you control 4 Links, because Link picked up a sword called the Four Sword that splits his soul into 4 copies. Kind of reminds me of Voldemort's Horcruxes, now that I think about it. And so you have to work together with the 4 Links to do different formations, as well as sometimes switching between them one at a time to, say, activate switches. A lot of times the puzzles are both super obtuse and super samey at the same time. I feel like so many puzzles keep repeating themselves, but the ones that don't have such outlandish solutions that they're some of the stupidest puzzles in Zelda history. Just to name one, there's a switch in one of the rooms that's blocked off by a bunch of statues. And so the way that you're supposed to hit the switch is you're supposed to throw the boomerang through the wall so that you can hit the switch in another room. Like, how many Zelda games are there where people would be able to figure that out? That just defies all laws of physics. For that matter, the physics aren't exactly consistent to begin with. You've got the bow, which can't shoot through certain things, but you've also got the boomerang, which can shoot through walls. So why is there not consistent rules with all of the items? Also, why is it so that some of the enemies can break the boundaries that the Links can't? But those are the least of my worries. What's really concerning about Four Swords Adventures is that it markets itself as a full Zelda game, but it feels more like a mini-game than anything, because the way the game is structured is, rather than being an actual adventure like the title would suggest, it feels more like a selection of vignettes that happen to be tied together by a very loose and forgettable story that even makes Paper Mario Sticker Star look like a grand narrative. Overall, I think Four Swords Adventures suffers from the fact that it doesn't have a sense of progression or growth like other Zelda games do. Rather than finding your way, exploring through a vast connected world, getting more items and becoming more powerful, you essentially feel like you're playing Majora's Mask and everything resets after each level. So every time you get a heart container and you increase your hearts, well, that's gone the next level. Every single level you have to power up the Four Sword by collecting 2,000 or more Force Gems so that you have enough power to vanquish the darkness. Where have we heard that one before? And it just feels like, okay, why is it that the enemies couldn't have just gotten tougher and the Lynx could have just accumulated more heart containers over the time? Do they like have really loose pockets and that's why they also can't hold on to any items and why you have to keep switching items? This is also a huge problem because there are 4 Lynx, but yet they all hold the same items. Like, why couldn't it be that each Link has a different item and you just switch between them? Wouldn't that promote more character switching? Isn't that usually the point of games where you have multiple protagonists? Now, you could say, well, Paul, that makes for more clever game design, but the thing is, the game itself allows that in a subsequent mode. Actually, for that matter, most of the game is actually locked away behind getting a Game Boy Advance or more and a Game Boy Advance to GameCube connecting cable or more. See, there's 3 different modes that you can play in Four Swords Adventures. There's Hyrulean Adventure, which is the only one you're seeing footage of because good luck trying to get all that fancy schmancy equipment in 2021 where, you play through the 21 levels and you try to stop Vader at the end. A pretty ho-hum story by Zelda standards. Then there's Shadow Battle, which is kind of like a top-down equivalent of Super Smash Bros., where the 4 Links have preset arenas and you have to duke it out to see who can be the last Link standing. And then finally you have Tingle's Tower, which is a collection of mini games that you play, but you can't even get into the tower unless you have at least 2 players, which means you need at minimum 2 Game Boy Advances, 2 Game Boy Advance to GameCube link cables, and the game and the GameCube. That's a lot of money, and it almost feels like pre-DLC DLC. So why is it that a GameCube game with honestly some pretty mind-blowing graphics even nowadays would make it so that only a third of the game is playable with the actual GameCube controller, and you feel like it should be a Game Boy Advance game that just has too realistic of graphics for the Game Boy Advance to spit out? Also, Minish Cap came out a year after this, so how did Nintendo go from this to a masterpiece in just 1 year? There's also the fact that the Lynx's swords are so puny that I feel like I have to be right on top of the enemies just to hit them. Also, why is it that the Lynx can move in 8 directions, but they can only swing their swords in 4? I feel like there are several times where I wanted to hit something diagonally, but the Lynx just didn't want to cooperate, and so I felt like combat was a lot harder than it should have been. Now, to offset this, the Lynx are able to get into different formations. And when you're playing with a GameCube controller, this works really well, because each formation is mapped to a different direction of the C-stick. And a lot of times it makes logical sense. Like, if you want to do the cross formation, you do left, because some Orthodox people cross themselves with the left hand. Or if you want to do a line, you just press the C-stick in the right direction. However, if you're playing this with a Game Boy Advance, then you have to hold down the button to cycle through the appropriate action. And this is another big problem that the game has, is that it doesn't do much to incentivize players to play with the main controller of a GameCube game on a GameCube. So, if anything, it almost feels like a penalty. Because when you're in an interior area, the game will show an icon of the Game Boy Advance SP to indicate you should be looking at your Game Boy Advance, so that whatever's outside is shown on the TV and whatever's inside is shown on your system. Now, I have actually gotten a chance to try this with the Game Boy Advance connected, and I found that the sound effects actually get worse because the Game Boy Advance has a vastly inferior sound chip. Despite all of that, the sound effects still get worse, even if you're playing it on a GameCube. A lot of times the sound effects will be muffled, sometimes even the music will be muffled. And in general, it just feels like they sort of went for the Super Mario 3D World mentality, where it's like, oh, you don't have a Wii remote, but we want to make sure that people who have a Wii remote don't feel left out, so everybody gets penalized. I wonder if the people that worked on this game worked on 3D World, because that would explain a lot. Overall, I think it's a cool concept that there can be puzzles that involve where maybe a giant bomb is going off on the TV and you have to hide on your Game Boy Advance to avoid getting exploded. But that doesn't make up for the rest of the game feeling like it's just a giant puzzle box. It doesn't feel like an adventure. The combat is so weak that it might as well not even exist. And while it is really cool that the power of the GameCube allows for much more enemy sprites to be on the screen than ever before, sometimes the hit detection for enemy encounters and actually hitting the enemies with your sword is so problematic that it's better to just avoid combat altogether if you weren't trying to collect enough force gems. Speaking of force gems, you might be wondering, why would you want to collect more than 2,000? Because you only need 2,000 to break the black barriers, so why not just stop? Well, it's because every allotment of force gems, I think it was every 1,000, gets you another force fairy. And these force fairies are basically your continues. So every time the links die, the force fairies revive them. Now that sounds pretty cool. It makes it so that the game has a nice handicap for people that might have a harder time playing it. The problem is that you eventually amass so many force fairies that by the time I got to the end of the game, I had like 84 left over. Most Zelda games only let you carry 6 fairies. The fact that you have 84 means that there's almost no room for there's almost no punishment. If you mess up, oh well, I've got 74 more fairies to go, so might as well just throw myself into the action, because if I die, oh well, it's not really that big of a penalty. Now, it may sound like I'm hating on this game a lot, and honestly I am. I think it's overpriced. There's way too much expectance for you to own the right equipment just for you to be able to play the game. The GameCube controller itself is only supported in one mode, and everything just feels like it's very half-baked, and like it doesn't really make a lot of sense in context. Like, first of all, they repeat a lot of the information so much, which I think is trying to make fun of certain Japanese talk shows where they comment on everything, which was already an annoyance in Pokemon, but why did they do it here? Why is it that every time I pick up an item, even if I picked up an item again that was already in the level, it has to retell me the same explanation every single time? Why doesn't it just do the do-do-do-do, and then I got the boomerang? Why is it that when I take a lot of damage, it says player 1 took great damage, instead of just, I don't know, hearing an obnoxious shout? Why is it that the links are so darn loud and the music is so darn quiet? Maybe it's just my TV, but I found that the links' shouting often was so bad that it was hard to actually hear the music. Speaking of the music is alright. I mean, most of the songs are remixes of existing Zelda tunes, especially from A Link to the Past, but they only sound marginally better, maybe like more rich in quality. Like Hyrule Castle feels closer to what an actual orchestra would play if they played it. But why is it that they didn't give you an option to turn down the volume of the links? Or at the very least, done better sound recording. I know the GameCube wasn't exactly the best when it came to music. Some of my least favorite Nintendo soundtracks were during the GameCube era. But this would have been fine if they just made it so that you could actually hear the music most of the time without blasting your eardrums with the links shouting every time they fell down a pit, swung their sword, and every time you go in and out of an area, you hear di-di-di-di, as if you broke some kind of rule because it's an alarm. Overall, even though this game has amazing graphics for its time, and it occasionally has some neat puzzles near the beginning and end of the game, the rest of the game either has really obtuse puzzle solving, or it just repeats itself so much so that it starts getting really stale, where it's like, okay, I've seen pots, so now I know what I have to do. I've seen blocks in this formation, so now I know what I have to do. And unlike Breath of the Wild, where they may have repeated puzzles, but you can have multiple creative solutions to figure out how to do them, you pretty much have to do things the way the game wants you to. Granted, there are a couple of exceptions to this, like if you have bombs or a fire rod, both of them can set fire to grass, which can get you more force gems, but Apart from that, it's a pretty linear experience. The game tries to pretend like it has branching pathways, but for the most part, it wants you to get from point A to point B. There's not really a whole lot of exploration, there's not really a whole lot of progress. The story is utterly forgettable, and even now I'm still curious about what the heck was going on. In fact, was Hyrule even in danger the whole time? They didn't make it really clear that there even was a threat to the environment. Was that just an excuse to tie these levels together loosely? So, the best thing I can say about Four Swords Adventures at the end of the day is it looks nice when it's outdoors. It does a nice mixture of the A Link to the Past and Wind Waker graphics, which is quite pleasing. If it was only Wind Waker graphics, I would have thrown a fit. But apart from that, I really do not think this is worth it, unless if you somehow are able to rent it. But even then, I imagine you'd only get enjoyment for the first 2 or 3 levels before you realize this is just an epic waste of time, because the story is so bad, and this just doesn't feel like a Zelda game. It feels like an extension of a side mode, which is what the original Four Swords was. Not only that, but if you only have a GameCube controller, you can only access a third of the game anyway, so it feels like a major ripoff, like one of those free-to-play games where you only get the first 2 chapters and you have to pay money for the rest of them. I think you should just skip this, especially because GameCube games nowadays are so overpriced and this is so hard to find. But I think it's better that this was just forgotten, and conveniently a year later, I think Nintendo must have thought the same thing, because Minish Cap came along and that also had the Four Sword, but that game was better in every single way than this, except perhaps the graphics. And that was on the Game Boy Advance, so what's this game's excuse? So I give this a very, 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 very low recommendation. I might think it's worth a repurchase if this were ever to be re-released on the Wii U, because it feels like that's tailor-made for the gamepad, but oh wait, the Wii U's obsolete. So how are they going to handle it on the Switch? Oh, they better not handle it the way they did Four Swords Anniversary Edition, or I am going to be fit to be tied. So with that, thank you very much for watching this rant of one of the worst Zelda games I have ever played. Do you think I'm barking mad? Do you think perhaps I might have been too hard on this game and you have fond childhood memories? Let me know in the comment section what you think, because I definitely welcome different opinions besides mine. And until the next time, keep the faith, stay epic, God bless, and I really hope that this kind of game isn't the future of Nintendo's DLC. Bye!